Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 4 in our community series. By way of brief introduction and purpose, JACL is one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the US. And the national conversation on anti-Black racism has really exploded in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Charleena Lyles, Manuel Ellis, and many others. So within this context, we in the Seattle JACL felt it was important to begin this series of conversations as a means to take responsibility and to promote solidarity. So as we welcome you, please enter your name, pronoun, and the civil rights or Black liberation activist who most inspired you in the chat. And then we'd also like to ask our JACL Anti-Blackness and Black Solidarity team to reintroduce themselves. So I'll start with Kyle.
Greetings. Kyle Kinoshta, JACL board member, former K-12 educator. He, him, and my leader is Malcolm X. Passing it to McKenna.
Hi, everybody. My name is McKenna, she, her pronouns. I am a former Seattle JACL board member and graphic designer and community engagement consultant in Seattle, and a civil rights activist and thinker that really inspires me is Adrienne Marie Brown. And I'll pass it over to Mieko.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mieko. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the National Youth Representative to the National Youth Student Council of the JACL. And the activist that inspires me would probably be Fannie Lou Hamer. I will pass to Gabrielle.
Mieko. I'm Gabrielle Kazuko Nomura Gaynor. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I've been volunteering with Seattle JACL since like 2013. And I'm also a Filipina Gose, and the person who inspires me is Nikita Oliver. And I will pass it off to Jess.
Hey everyone, my name is Jess. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently a Seattle JACL board member and civil rights Black liberation activist. Who most inspires me is Larry Gossett from the Gang of Four here in Seattle. And I'll pass it over to Emily.
Thanks, Jess. My name is Emily Kawahigashi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a JACL member. And an activist that has recently been inspiring for me is someone named Selema Masekela, who is activating on behalf of the surfing community for more folks of color. And I will also briefly mention that Hayen Park is also part of our planning committee. She is unable to make it today, but we definitely appreciate all the contributions she has made. And I'll pass it to Emma.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma. I use she, her pronouns. I'm part of the planning committee and work for the Wing Luke Museum. Someone who's inspired me in recent years has been local activist Daeshik Kim Hawkins Jr. And I will pass it back.
All right, so before we get started, we're just gonna acknowledge the land that we're on today. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Snohomish, Duwamish, and Indigenous peoples of our local area. As well, we acknowledge the experiences of genocide, forced relocation, ethnic cleansing, and land theft so that we can build our awareness of how racism and settler colonialism have impacts that exist to the present day. We honor the resurgence of culture, economy, and way of life of tribal nations of our local area. As community members, we resolve to learn more from these realities so that we can work toward a more just society. And whether you're joining us from Seattle or elsewhere, we invite you to learn more about the occupied territory on which you reside and the Indigenous people connected to the land. A great resource in Seattle that we have is Real Rent Duwamish, and we will drop the link in the chat below. And I'll pass it off to Emily.
Thanks. So we are at our 4th session. So the first 3, which were already held, were about the origins of anti-Black racism and the development of modern whiteness. The 3rd was about how Japanese Americans and the larger Asian community moved from the racial underclass prior to World War II to the mythical, quote, model minority and its role in anti-Blackness. The fourth, today, is about how our JA Seattle community has acted in solidarity with Black activism and adopted several parallel strategies and approaches to address anti-Asian racism. These traditions are the foundation of today's activism in the JA community, and we will also be discussing today how can the JA community show support and solidarity with the Black community in combating anti-Black racism and to achieve justice in the form of reparations and other demands. Also, in the future, we look forward to delving further into these questions of our anti-racist identity with 2 sessions with Dr. Ayana Yonemura, a professor of Asian Studies for the University of California, Davis, which we will preview at the end of this session with more information. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit here. Among other things today, we're talking about a lot of different things within Asian and Black solidarity, but we are going to be talking about the model minority myth and what that really means to push back on this myth. So in a minute, I am going to be pulling up 2 of my role models to the virtual stage, Bill Tashma and Stan Shikuma, to discuss this more. And there's this saying that's often brought up when we're talking about privilege: it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And, you know, we didn't ask to be model minorities as Asians. We didn't ask to be upheld by white folks above other people of color, but it's still our responsibility to push back on the ways that society is privileging us and denying other folks of color. You know, we as Japanese Americans, as model minorities, we benefit. We benefit from greater safety, security. So sorry, just lost my place. We benefit from greater safety, security, freedom, and opportunity, and because the system is rigged in our favor. As writer Frank Chin said of Asian Americans in 1974, whites love us because we're not Black. And so as we as an intergenerational community continue to have these candid conversations about these issues so that we can, you know, truly uproot the anti-Blackness that's still inherent in our community, we need to be able to, you know, interrogate our ideas of success with regards to the American dream, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, like after being incarcerated during World War II, for example, and other ways that we have been granted proximity to whiteness. You know, we must remember that even though we have worked very hard in this country as Japanese Americans, there's nothing that makes us more worthy or more inherently good or more deserving than other people of color. So, Stan Shikuma, if you are there, in a minute, if you could unmute yourself and answer this question, that would be awesome. But Stan, in the past, I've heard you discuss how the Japanese art of taiko allowed you to defy expectations about being a well-behaved Asian American. For those of you who don't know, although most of you probably do know, Stan is a legendary, very incredibly gifted taiko drummer and artist. And I love this example because it just shows how by being ourselves as Nikkei, we can be powerful forces for change, for justice, and for anti-racism. And in some ways, I wonder if returning to the very essence of our Nikkei-ness, we can push back on being model minorities. And how can our traditions, our culture, or even Japanese forms of spirituality or worldview like Buddhism, Shintoism, connection to nature and ancestors, et cetera, how can these things be assets to us in our anti-racism work? Stan.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, for that generous introduction. So when taiko first started developing in the United States, it was in the late 60s and early 70s. So that's the time period when the civil rights movement was in full swing. The movement against the Vietnam War was going on. The Black Power movement was going, and the Asian American movement drew a lot of inspiration from that. And so we had Asian American movement, third world strikes, a lot of solidarity between peoples of color trying to take control of their lives. And part of that was taiko developed. And a lot of sansei, my generation, who back then we were pretty young, gravitated towards that because the model minority myth told us that we were quiet, we were well behaved, we didn't rock the boat, we followed the rules, and we succeeded. You know, we studied hard and shut our mouth, basically, and took jobs and did not expect to become the leaders, the executive directors, or you know, take major positions of responsibility. We just kind of were the little worker bees. So with taiko, we had folks who got up on stage and they were not quiet. You know, we were just learning, but people were pretty wild, jumping around, making a lot of noise. And it kind of broke a lot of stereotypes of that quiet Asian. And it drew a lot of us to it because of that, because we were able to express something that broke out of that stereotype that had been kind of enforced on us. And the model minority myth is just that. It's a myth. It's a stereotype created by a white dominant society that we were supposed to follow in order to be successful. And if we deviated from that, then we also got blowback from society. So I think that whole generation and that whole ambiance of kind of breaking stereotypes was a liberating feeling for a lot of us. And that can and often did lead to liberation in other areas, in social thoughts, in political thoughts, in how we thought of ourselves and our community in relation to America and in relation to other communities of color. So, and it also, I think Malcolm X had made a big deal about that time about self-respect, self-determination, self-defense. And what we saw in taiko and growing out of that was self-respect, that we should respect ourselves and our community for where we came from, what we represented, what we did. So being Buddhist was not a bad thing like it was during the war. Being Japanese was not a bad thing like it was during the war. Speaking a language other than English was not a bad thing like it was during the war. And so I think the idea of self-determination, that we can determine what we want to be in this country and the country needs to accept that, was kind of revolutionary at the time. And unfortunately, it still is. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that there's so much of this that is like, when you were speaking, I was just thinking about how we need to reclaim our own power as Asians and as Japanese people, and we need to liberate our own minds and selves, free ourselves from white supremacy. And we have to do that before we can show up in solidarity for Black and Indigenous folks and other people of color. So thank you so much, Stan. Okay, Uncle Bill, your turn. So you and Stan have both dedicated your lives to civil rights and social justice, but you also shared with me recently that some of this anti-racism work, you still feel like a beginner. And this is a space that's about holding ourselves accountable, but it's also a space where we're here to learn, kind of no matter where we might be at in our individual journeys. And all are welcome here as long as we're all moving towards the goal of anti-racism. None of us are experts. And so I'm wondering if you can share, Bill, how some of your thinking has evolved with regards to being the model minority and what ways you are still evolving to be more in solidarity with Black folks and with other people of color. And I think I speak for, everyone here who knows you and who knows Stan, that like, if you and Stan are still, works in progress, then there's hope for the rest of us to do better as well. So in what ways do you feel like, yeah, you're still evolving, and where have you, how have you sort of grown on this journey?
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. The first thing I want to do is I want to thank Stan because, you know, every time he speaks, I'm just so inspired and impressed. And you pack a lot into what you say, Stan, so thank you. And I hope that I can answer your questions, the theme that you set, Gabrielle. I made some notes and they're more observations and comments, so we'll see how this goes. But I did want to start off with a quote. And the quote is, "It seems to me to be an irony of our times that though we are surrounded by almost unbelievable communication marvels, we still seem to fear or mistrust warm personal dialogue, the talking with and listening to people which go beyond the trivialities of human encounters. And it seems to me that this very lack of deep human communication is in a large part contributory to the tensions and misunderstandings and hatred so evident in so much of our society today." The reason I bring up this quote is this is from the JACL newsletter from 1965. And what it talks about is in regard to all the civil unrest that was happening during the 60s. And what JACL was doing at the time was having workshops between communities where they would bring in Japanese JACL members and members of the Hispanic community one time, or the Black community, or other communities, to have one-on-one conversations or small group conversations. And so I want to thank JACL for continuing this. And I want to thank Gabrielle, you and McKenna, Hayun, and Kyle, and everyone else in the committee for doing this work. It's so important. And so just for those who don't know me, a little bit about my background. I'm a gay sansei going on 70, originally from Cleveland, Ohio. Been a member of JACL since the mid-60s, moved to Seattle in 1980. I am a product of the 60s and 70s in almost every way. And there was a lot of turmoil in the 1960s. And there were a lot of riots and everything going on. And we had riots in Cleveland. I remember I worked in the inner city, and I remember going to work in the summer and having to go by Jeeps with machine guns mounted and going to my work, which was surrounded by employees and sandbags and shotguns guarding the doors. You know, the riot in Detroit, 43 people were killed. There was one in Newark that 26 people were killed. And it prompted Lyndon Johnson to issue a commission on civil unrest. And it was called the Kerner Report. And the quote that everybody remembers is, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal." And it's troubling to me because in many ways we haven't changed. After 55 years, we haven't changed. And I think about it, and I think that in the 60s and 70s, as a young person, I thought I knew the issues. I thought we knew the solutions. And now, 55 years later, I know that no, we're still in the same position. I don't know the answers. I'm still learning. I'm trying to figure everything out. I'm trying to balance my generational perspectives. And so I always think my first step here is to listen. And that's what I mentioned to McKenna a few months ago, that I'm looking forward to these workshops as a chance for me to listen. So when I started thinking about the multi-minority myth, and I started thinking about it, and I realized that it's real. This thought, it was prevalent in the 60s among many Anisi, which always astounded me. Just a short time after the concentration camps, I heard this subtly in my family and with other family friends, and often it was also under the guise of a subtle superiority. I think that Japanese Americans, that I should remember, Japanese Americans were superior to other people. No one ever said, "Japanese Americans, you are superior." But I think the subtle messaging behind all this was that, just remember you're better than everybody. So, that was present, and I'm not suggesting that. And also, the other subtle message is you need to keep doing this. You need to work harder so we can keep the respect, the Hakujin or the Caucasian community, which is another aspect of about women. I just want to just go over some just thoughts that I had that I put down kind of brainstorming because I was really getting upset about this whole idea of a model minority. And this is part of it is like, you know, these things I just don't understand. Why do immigrant groups need to prove themselves? Who are we trying to prove ourselves to? Is this some type of initiation or game? Hey, who's making the rules? And what is success that we should have, that we obtained? And should progressing like other citizens be considered a success, or should it just be expected? Is acting white or like the majority success? Why does anybody need to work harder to obtain the same progress? Why on earth would we or any group be compared to other groups? How can we compare our history of years of injustice to other groups' history of centuries of injustice? Success is not when JAs attend a position and it's announced as the first Japanese Americans to do this. Success should be when a Japanese American attains a position and is announced just by name and the new position without referencing any race or being Japanese American. And so really model minority isn't just a way to divide minority committees and sow division. For Japanese Americans, isn't this just a ploy to believe, a facade that even if we aren't really fully accepted, at least we are better than other groups? And really isn't the bottom line, if we need to keep up this disguise of a model minority just to keep our so-called status, then really we haven't obtained anything. And so those are just some random thoughts. And now I'm going to turn it back to you because it's my turn to just listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill and Stan. I think we can go to the next slide, but I want to thank you both so much for sharing your stories. You know, there's so much power in our intergenerational community. And as I said, we're all at different places in this journey of anti-racism. And I love the idea that we as a community, as, you know, people of different ages and with different experiences as Nikkei can help enable our collective growth and evolution. So next slide, please.
All right, and for our agenda today, you had the chance to hear from both Bill and Stan. Thank you, Bill and Stan, for our introduction. We're also going to be highlighting some conversation guidelines before we get started in our breakout rooms and the material for today. And we're also going to be focusing on the 4 questions below in the breakout rooms. Where have you experienced or seen others be subjected to pressure to adopt the white racial frame? How did you arrive at your sense of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter liberation movement? How can Japanese Americans continue to know and build on our history? And how can we continue the work of our elders and ancestors in the fight for justice, as well as keep pushing the boundaries of justice-centered work? And I'll pass it off to Emma for the next slide.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending today's program. As we move into the discussion and teaching portion, I just wanted to go over again a few conversation guidelines as well as some general Zoom housekeeping. So first of all, just a quick reminder that we are recording this program. You can choose to have your video on or off. But we did want to create a space where we can see each other's faces and be honest together. So if you feel comfortable, we would really welcome you to keep your video on. I believe McKenna dropped the recording from the last session in the chat, but recordings will continue to be available for a limited amount of time to everyone who registered for the event. And so this will be sent by email after the event as a reference that you can hold on to. Enter the Zoom room muted, and we ask that you continue to keep yourself muted until we are in breakout groups or designated moments for larger group discussion. And we encourage you to continue to interact with us as you have been and drop questions in the chat. McKenna is monitoring that for us today. And then if you'd like to pin speakers so that their video is large, you can do that by clicking the 3 dots at the right corner of their video and click pin. So I want to move into our community guidelines for conversation today. We want to acknowledge that this is a space where we welcome both old friends and new friends, and many of you we've seen now. This is our fourth time seeing you together in these workshops. So we hope that we can continue to grow our relationships together through this program series. But we also welcome those who are joining us for the first time. Our long-term relationship management strategy is rooted in the strength of our relationships past, present, and future. And I think Bill and Stan are such a testament to, when we're looking at the wealth of knowledge they bring to this conversation. So as such, we will maintain intentional dialogue with attendees before, after, and throughout this discussion series. And we're grateful to each of you for being an important part of our community and for starting and continuing this journey of learning with us. As we make new connections, we will work to create an intentional and accountable community together. And today we recognize that we are limited in our ability to do deep trust building work over the course of just today's program. And for that reason, we're continuing to commit to this discussion series and are offering these conversation guidelines in place of what would normally be a trust building and group agreement process. So please use these guidelines, which I'll go through really quickly, to help frame your expectations and boundaries for personal engagement in this event and in the discussion portion of the event as well. So how care for yourself. So whether that means turn the camera when you need to, taking breaks, lying down, staying hydrated, do whatever you need for yourself throughout this program. What's said here stays here. What's learned here leaves here. Please do not share people's names or stories without their consent, but please do share what you've reflected on and learned from listening to others today. Move up and move back. If you're someone that tends to share a lot, think about practicing listening in these spaces. And if you're someone that tends to listen more, think about practicing sharing. Share joy in conversation and lift each other up. If someone says something you love, lift it up, celebrate it. Celebrate what others are bringing to the table. Be mindful of when and how you are processing new thoughts and new feelings. Stop and think about who's in the room, what your impact might be, and who is best to process your thoughts and feelings with. Sometimes doing that in the room is great, and sometimes taking a moment to write down your thoughts in a journal or something similar is also a great way to process. We recognize that active listening is also participation. Bill did a wonderful job of kind of lifting that up today. Disagreement over ideas happens, and we recognize that that's okay. We recognize that we may experience discomfort. We continue to practice curiosity, self-reflection, and an openness to learning. We will do our best to speak our personal truths rather than trying to speak for the group. We recognize that these discussions are a journey and may not necessarily end with a sense of closure. And once again, I remind you that you can definitely put your questions in the chat, and we welcome and encourage that. And now I will pass it back to Kyle. Thank you.
Thank everyone so much. So I'll be presenting today, and again, I want to thank Gabrielle, Bill, and Stan for doing a perfect introduction to the topic today. And I think you'll see this throughout the presentation. So just before we jump into our main topic, which is traditions of anti-racism in the Japanese American Asian community, I just want to do very briefly bring us up to where we have come from in the last three sessions. So in the past three sessions, we laid out two important narratives central to taking a stand against anti-Blackness, especially in our Japanese American community. The first, which was covered in our first few meetings, was the history and current state of anti-Blackness and how it was woven in the very fabric of the founding of the United States, and how the concept of race was a way of stratifying society that is, in many ways, a uniquely American invention. It was used to justify the massive land theft from the original inhabitants of the country, and as well as the assignment of the status of property for Africans who were forcibly abducted from their continent. And then later, for the super exploitation of early imported Asian labor, our ancestors. We examined also how modern whiteness and anti-Blackness were intentionally engineered by those in power by government and corporate policies after World War II. So what we're going to do just before we get into our traditions is to look at this thing that we call the model minority narrative. And this introduction relates to a lot of what Bill and Stan talked about and how they evolved and rejected that narrative that a lot of us grew up with. The second narrative that we explored in our third session was a transition of Asian Americans and Japanese Americans from a despised brown people, which was our existence prior to World War II, to the government-initiated and intentional admission into privilege of some Asian Americans after World War II, and how it served to benefit the system of white supremacy in terms of its international status, and how it was also weaponized against Black and Brown anti-racist struggles, particularly the civil rights movement, from a very, very early stage. And in our sessions, we also explored the internalized parts of the model minority myth that somehow Japanese Americans transcended racism, as Bill and Stan said, because we were special, because of our special hard work and special embrace of whiteness. We talked about how this translated into anti-Blackness when the question is put before us, what should be the response to racism? And why is there still racism? To talk about our rejection of this narrative, we first have to look at our enforced embrace of whiteness and the white narrative on race and racism. So one of the books I've read recently, The Myth of the Model Minority, points out a couple things. And these are things that we know because it's our lived experience. The constant pressure to internalize these ideas of privilege and superiority. But as Rosalind Cho and Joe Fagan talk about in their book, privilege comes at a price. The bargain that white supremacy attempts to foist on us to do their bidding on their behalf. Basically, it's continual pressure to acquiesce to white demands for complicity. I have my own stories, and in a minute you'll get to tell yours. But I have stories myself, for example. I'm one who was granted access to privilege. I was a school district administrator in 2 school districts and got to be part of the top leadership. But I would experience lots of different things. For example, being assigned to manage Black and Latinx equity managers in 2 different districts who were oftentimes labeled behind their backs whack jobs because they both called out racism. And the fact that, basically, because I refused to silence them, oftentimes being called on the carpet because somehow I wasn't being collaborative. Or in another district that had within its boundaries Native American tribal nation, when things got tense between the tribal leaders and white school district leaders, sort of being given the implicit idea that I should, quote unquote, help out the district leaders because I'm a minority. But then finding out when I expressed opinions about the justness of tribal grievances, ending up being frozen out of the work. So there are many places in our lives and careers where we encounter the reality of our status of being enforced to help out white supremacy writ large. So at this point, we want to give folks a chance to unpack a little bit of their own experience because of the fact that many people have many stories. And this is what this session is about, the stories on how we actually dealt with this phenomenon. So we're going to have a short breakout. McKenna is going to get us into breakouts where we'll just kind of unpack this question. Where have you experienced or seen others be subjected to pressure to adopt the white racial frame, as we talked about? So McKenna?
Thank you, Kyle. Yep, I'm opening the room, so you should see a link to join. Welcome back, everybody. Looks like we're all here, so I'll turn it back over to Kyle.
Thank you. Yes, at least in my breakout, I found, fascinating stories just in terms of, not only questions, but both our background. So I want to move to the next subject here and make sure my PowerPoint's right. And in many ways, this is the most important idea of our whole four-part series. And it is true that the model minority narrative is a perfect description of colonized thinking. The history of Japanese American and Asian American community, we also have counter examples of the rejection of this narrative, and the fact that there are many of us throughout our existence here in this country that have adopted a decolonizing counter narrative. And today we'll talk about stories of community members who have done this, which is kind of the most important thing that we started with Gabrielle, Bill, and Stan, are our stories about how we made this journey. So
interject quickly, and I think you're trying to share your screen. I just want to make sure you get that opportunity.
Oh boy, okay.
Thank you.
Let me make sure that's, okay, hang on here. Yeah, I didn't know we unshared, so hang on here. Thanks, and let me know if we come back from breakout that, somehow I don't get that down. All right, good, thank you. So, in any case, we'll be talking about not only, our stories of the folks in our room present, like we did with Bill and Stan, but we'll also talk about some of the stories of, some of the heroes on our community. And while we won't have time to go deeply into them, we hope that you can go to places like Densho or read some of the books that have been written about them, or go to sites like the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History website, which is pretty accessible, and read some of their stories, because they were very inspiring about how they made this journey. These stories are actually powerful assets for learning for us today. And in particular, it's the story of how did they get to this place of making a difference. In some ways, it's not so much a mystery, but looking at how they met the challenge. And I'm sure that people can sort of testify this. Living in our model minority existence can be just sort of like floating along in a tidal current. You don't really know it exists, and a lot of people say this, I just sort of grew up in it. You do find out when you turn around and go another direction. And then all of a sudden you feel it's full force. When our community members that we'll talk about today, as well as many in the room here, started viewing hard realities about the world around them, as well as truthful accounts of history, and they reflected on it, they arrived at some pretty important conclusions. All of a sudden then, you learn about the tide because now you're actually fighting it. That's the significance of Stan's story and Bill's stories, and many of the others we'll talk about today, and why theirs are so powerful. I would also relate that it's also mine as a young Japanese American teen growing up here in Seattle, connecting the story of the incarceration that I just learned about with the same racism faced by the Black liberation movement, and beginning to admire groups like the Black Panthers. I still have this in my file as just kind of a souvenir from that time. And then beginning to abandon the apolitical student box of my friends circle, and then go on to participate because I thought it was important to make a contribution to the activism of the 70s in Seattle that I'll describe later. Now, if you read about the people, some of the heroes of the community, such as the women on the screen, Michi Nishira Wegland, Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, Yuri Kochiyama, Aki Kurose, and Cherry Kinoshita, and yes, there is a relation. They broke out of the accepted role of quiet Nisei woman and did so against various kinds of intimidating sexism aimed at putting them back in their place. So in talking about stories of liberation from the model minority, we hope that today you can share aspects of your own story about how you arrived at a certain place and how you learned to swim against the tide. The story of how many of us in the Seattle Japanese American and Asian community began to reject old narratives came out of life experience growing up here. If we look at our historical roots, we can understand how we came to stand with Black solidarity. If you grew up in Seattle, there were like so many cities in the 50s and 60s and practicing just outright and blatant segregation. And as you can see from the map, because Asians and Blacks were segregated together, it shouldn't be a surprise that Asian Americans and Japanese Americans, that there would be a trend in the community that would sympathize with Black anti-racism. The Black Civil Rights Movement had a profound impact on many Seattle Asian Americans in the 1960s. To understand solidarity in our Japanese American community and rejection of anti-Blackness, I'd recommend studying the history of Black resistance, not only in this country, but as well locally. That was its inspiration, and how it merged with other streams of resistance, such as against war and militarism. For example, on May 4th, 1970, the response to the shootings at Kent State. The picture on the bottom is Interstate 5, just south of 45th Street, where 10,000 students from the University of Washington went onto the freeway to protest repression against the anti-war movement. And as well, a lot of these other scenes are from Seattle. Somebody mentioned their hero being Larry Gossett. That's Larry Gossett as a young man launching the Black student unions in this region. So while the onset of the model minority narrative and attaining new privilege was a really strong current, the rawness of racism that the Issa and Nisei had experienced in the 60s, only 20 years before, was also strong. This lived experience coalesced with the Black Civil Rights Movement to start producing members of the community with the wisdom and the courage to buck the ocean tide of the model minority current. It started with pioneering Nisei, not only across the country, but here in Seattle. Yuri Kochiyama, who was pretty much based in New York, was an outspoken supporter of the 1960s Black liberation movements and was present when Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Yuri continued to build coalitions between Black and Asian American activists, in addition to mobilizing for the end of the Vietnam War, and also working on Japanese American redress and many, many other issues until her passing in 2014. Aki Kurose, here in Seattle, after suffering the same discrimination in housing that Black families faced in the 1960s, joined the Congress of Racial Equality to champion fair housing. She went on to support desegregation of Seattle schools, as well as working for peace, disarmament, and justice in education. Philip Hayasaka was active in supporting Seattle civil rights causes. He formed the Asian Coalition for Equality, the first Seattle Pan-Asian organization that supported civil rights and took many actions to serve both the Black and Asian community. I hope that you can read about them, because all three of them had to show inspiring courage just to take these things up. We're not like just simply taking up hobbies or something like that. They actually had to find ways to resist the narrative that they were born into. Yuri, for example, faces surveillance and threats by the US government for her activism. Aki was labeled a communist and had to rebuff the disapproval of other Nisei about her politics and the fact that a Black man had married into the family.
Hey,
Phil,
I'm
yes.
so sorry to interrupt again, but we're having a little choppy audio problem with you. So I'm not sure if you could move some people say if you move closer to the screen, it's a little bit more clear. I know we've tested before and moving further back was better. So
Thank you. I think what I'll do maybe to help, it could be my internet. So I'm going to shut off my screen and see whether that helps if it is a bandwidth problem too.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt.
There we go. Okay, let me know if you hear that again. In any case, Phil not only had a cross burned on his lawn, he had to work to overcome the mistrust of Black leaders who suspected that the city of Seattle had appointed him to his possession in order to subvert civil rights. The Sunset generation, which both, Bill, Stan, and I belong to, and which they talked about growing up in the 60s, who saw the waves of protest and struggle here in Seattle, watched and learned, even if they didn't act at first. Militant activism that emulated that in the Black community started with a small group of Japanese and Asian American activists in 1970, particularly Al Sugiyama and Mike Tagawa. In the beginning, there were many in the community who kind of thought they were crazy. And according to Mike, some thought that Mike was on drugs. But many young Seattle Sunset generation students and youth became radicalized during early struggles against discrimination, starting that year at Seattle Central Community College, and then later in support of ethnic and Asian studies on local college campuses, where I began to be active. A seminal event in the community erupted in the early 70s when it became clear that big corporate interests wanted to do what we would call today gentrify the International District. This was sparked when it was decided to locate the Kingdome, which is the forerunner to Lumen Field in what's now SoDo. The county began all of a sudden becoming concerned about fire codes and literally evicted the mostly Filipino and Chinese residents and literally dumping them out on the street and beginning to facilitate the destruction of the identity as a historically defined community. Asian American activists began taking action, demanding housing and social services for the historical residents of the International District community. Major events in this battle were the 1972 heated confrontation of Asian activists who took direct action and how they confronted politicians at the groundbreaking ceremony at the building of the Kingdome. In the ensuing years, activists resorted to direct action, including marches and this occupation of the offices of King County Executive John Spellman, where I was also present. The results of several years of this were the development of some of the low and middle income housing developments, as well as the funding of social services that you see there today. The point in telling the story is that the lived experience of the Black movement taught the Sansei to reject the idea that one had to stay within the acceptable and respectable channels of elected officials and the bureaucracy. Now, many of us know that one of the signal accomplishments of the Seattle JACL is initiating and leading the successful campaign for redress, an apology, and $20,000 compensation for incarceration. While there is a lot of work within traditional bureaucratic and legislative channels, it can also be inspired. It can be argued that the inspiration for the entire effort stemmed from the energy of the Black civil rights movement in the first place. It can also be argued that without significant work at the grassroots level and pivotal events of mass mobilization, one of the hallmarks of the civil rights movement, the redress effort wouldn't have been succeeded. We have a recording, which I won't have time to play, but if you get this PowerPoint and go to that site, Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History, you can hear one of our activist pioneers, Al Sugiyama, talk about the fact that this activist energy was one of the things that helped eventually power the movement for redress. Now, in many ways, the struggle that the Seattle JACL had in spearheading redress was directly confronting the model minority narrative. If you read accounts of the redress movement, it shows that one of the biggest obstacles the Seattle JACL, Nikkei, and Sansei faced were some in the conservative national JACL leadership who embodied the model minority of fear of offending white racism. So two events stand out in this. The very first day of remembrance, which we're about to commemorate in 1978, so clearly made a statement that the supposed opposition of the Japanese American community to redress was a complete fallacy. Another event was a response to the delaying tactics of the national JACL, who managed to get the US Congress to postpone action on redress by creating a commission to quote unquote study whether the incarceration was unjust, which, you know, I'm sure most people would say that's kind of a stupid question. Yet the Seattle JACL's response was to organize hundreds of Nikkei in 20 cities to testify at commission hearings. The significance of this was huge because, as we know, many Nikkei had been so traumatized by the incarceration that they didn't even tell their Sansei children about it in many cases. 750 Nikkei and Issei broke through decades of enforced silence and told heartrending, horrifying stories of the racism that they had endured in quiet but starkly powerful ways. Transcripts of their testimony survive and demonstrate the power of voice and numbers. It's doubtful that without this, redress would have succeeded. As well, Black solidarity assisted the final passage of this bill. It wouldn't have passed, for example, without the support of the Congressional Black Caucus, especially Ron Dellums, who spoke in impassioned ways in support of it, or Reverend Martin Dimely, another congressperson who spoke representing Gardena, a heavily Nikkei district. They were responsible for wrangling the Congressional Black Caucus's support for redress, which was pretty powerful, and helped support redress in many, many other ways, and actually helped move the Senate hearing to eventually pass. This whole account shows that we have much in our heritage that we can learn from, be inspired by, and give credit when it comes to taking stands for today's Black Lives Matter movement. So we're going to have another short breakout to reflect a little bit on how you yourselves, made this journey. Because if you're here, we know it's because you have some levels of support for Black liberation, and particularly how it shows up this year today. So McKenna will be putting us in breakout so we can debrief a little bit and consider this question: how did you arrive at your sense of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter liberation movement? So McKenna, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Kyle. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry if I cut off some conversations there. I'm going to go ahead and turn the keys back over to Kyle.
Okay, and this time I'm going to remember to share my screen and unmute myself. There we go. Okay, we're heading into the last section, and that's actually to bring us into the present. As Emily talked about in the very beginning, the Seattle JACL has an ongoing mission. Is the reason why we're here today is actually to, really move forward civil rights and, handle the current issues of today, not only of Japanese Americans, but of other communities that are victimized by injustice. The JCL responds to issues that enhance or threaten civil and human rights of all Americans and really implement strategies to affect positive social change, this being one of them. But today we actually want to talk about a few others, and our team is going to actually help bring us to the present. Now, in the most recent history, the Nikkei generation who experienced incarceration led movements to get redress have largely passed on. And the Sansei, who were the young activists in the 60s and 70s, went on to a variety of careers. Many are still active. Many others have retreated from public activism. However, there are new generations that have taken on the legacy of Japanese American and Asian political activism. So there have been, in the last 20 years, new issues that connected with the lived experience of the Japanese American community who lived through incarceration. 9/11, of course, brought to the forefront the same racial hysteria brought to bear against the American Muslim community the Japanese Americans experienced. And since that time, strong theme of JCL has been support for Muslim communities. JCL has taken stand against anti-Muslim attacks, the Trump administration, Muslim ban, and many, many others issues connected to that. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to team members to help speak about two other really important issues that the JCL has taken on. McKenna and I believe Stan is going to help out.
Thank you, Kyle. And yes, Stan, please feel free to chime in at any time. I wanted to share a little bit about a new avenue for anti-racist activism that's taken flight through Sudo for Solidarity. Sudo for Solidarity is a nonviolent direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates working to stop repeating history. Their mission is to educate, advocate, and protest to close all US concentration camps, build solidarity with other communities of color that have experienced forced removal, detention, deportation, separation of families, and other forms of racial and state violence, and to coordinate intergenerational cross-community healing circles addressing the trauma of our shared histories. The Seattle branch of Sudo is fearlessly led by Stan Shikuma, who you heard speak at the beginning of our presentation today. In partnership with and under the vision of La Resistencia, which is a Washington-based grassroots organization working to end immigrant detention and deportations, Sudo Seattle has been very active at campaigning for release of people detained at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, which is one of the largest immigration prisons in the US. Sudo has recently concluded an exploratory process to define its next steps. Through listening sessions last fall, Sudo heard a desire for a progressive voice in the JA community, a bold space for Nikkei, and a space for acceptance and healing. Moving forward, Sudo will work to end family and child detention, abolish prisons and police, and seek redress and reparations through education, advocacy, protest, community and solidarity building, and healing circles. In all this work, Sudo is committed to uprooting anti-Blackness in the JA community and our society at large. Some ways that Sudo will work towards this uprooting is by educating JA communities and supporting efforts for reparations, building relationships with Black-led reparations movements and abolitionist organizations, expanding healing circles for other communities, and continuing to hold space for multiracial Nikkei. On national and local levels, Sudo has a long way to go to healing our community's internalized racism and our reinforcement of anti-Black oppression. This anti-Blackness shows up even in the way that we have historically engaged and continue to engage in activism that is not in relationship with and does not center the leadership, voices, and experiences of Black people. But I know that the visionary minds who pour their love and labor into Sudo are honest about how big this challenge is and how much we all have to learn. Sudo's focus on collective liberation through healing practices, values, and relationships, its deep respect for the leadership of both elders and youth, its capacity to mobilize our community on a national scale, and its badass co-chairs, who are some of the most dedicated civil rights workers in our community, really fills me with pride and hope. And I look forward to following and participating in Sudo's journey. And I'll drop the link for Sudo in the chat if you want to learn more. Thank you so much, Kyle. I think I'll pause and see if Stan has anything else to share before I turn it over to Mieko. Stan, any?
Oh, I just put in the chat an announcement that Sudo for Solidarity, along with Seattle JCL, Puyallup JCL, Densho, Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee, and probably a few other community groups and La Resistencia will be doing a car caravan from the Puyallup Fairground, which was the site of the infamous Camp Harmony during World War II, to the Northwest Detention Center, the currently infamous site of ICE detention in the state of Washington. That'll be Sunday, February 21st, will meet and start the caravan in Puyallup at 1 p.m., then go over to NWDC and finish over there by 3 p.m. is the plan. More details will be coming out in the next week or two.
Thanks for that opportunity to get involved, Stan.
Sure.
Yeah, and thank you both for sharing what is really a central part of the JCL's work. There is another issue which JCL as a whole, not just Seattle, is taking on, and Mieko is actually going to share something about that, which is HR 40, Black Reparations. Mieko?
Sure, thank you, Kyle. So as Kyle was saying, another important avenue for Black solidarity is support for Black reparations. And we talked about it in the last few sessions, and as we know, slavery is it's commonly referred to as the original sin of the United States. It's one of the greatest crimes against humanity. And discussions of reparations for enslaved people have existed almost as long as there have been enslaved people in North America. So I think the most commonly recognized one in terms of federal reparations for freed slaves happened in 1865 at the close of the Civil War. It was an idea generated by Black leaders and then suggested to the Union General William Sherman to confiscate land from slaveholders and grant 40 acres and a mule to each family. So Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, which would do so after President Lincoln approved it. But as we know, the next year, Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's successor in the presidency, he was also a Confederate sympathizer and the first president to be impeached, he overturned it. So it did not come to pass. In the modern embodiment of federally legislated reparations, HR 40, which is named for 40 acres and a mule, is a bill that proposes a commission to study, and I'm going to quote from the bill language, the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans. So this bill was originally introduced in 1989, the year after the Civil Liberties Act passed, by Congressman John Conyers, who is now passed, but he based the framework of his bill actually on the bill written by Senator Inouye, outlining the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which led to the commission that led to personal justice denied, that led to redress. So these two movements are not separate silos at all. They're very much interlocked. And Congressman Matsui and Secretary Mineta, they were some of the original supporters of HR 40. But the important part of HR 40 is understanding that it's a commission to study the effects of slavery, and it has been introduced in every Congress for 32 years now, and not once has it made it to the floor. So it was just reintroduced by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee a couple weeks ago. But this past Congress, the 116th, was the closest it has ever come to any sort of movement. So it garnered 173 co-sponsors just in the House. It was the first year it had a Senate companion, which was proposed by Senator Booker. And it was also the first time that presidential candidates were speaking about it as a tangible possibility. That being said, the urgency of this legislation does nothing but increase. It was urgent when slavery was happening. It was urgent when Field Order 15 was issued, and the urgency of it is really highlighted for us now as we see these colliding movements of, demanding racial justice and the impact and racial disparities of COVID-19. The reparations for the impact of slavery are urgent now more than ever. So what does that mean for Japanese Americans? In 2015, the JCL, which you're seeing a screenshot of now, the JCL passed a resolution to support HR 40 as a measure. And this is important for Japanese Americans to understand and to be vocal about, because in every discussion of Black reparations, the subject of Japanese American redress surfaces. Sometimes it's referred to as the legal precedent, sometimes it's referred to as a political guide, a moral standard, but it's also referenced a lot by those who are in opposition to Black reparations. And Japanese Americans in the situation once again find ourselves being used as a model minority. So redress is referred to as, a reasonable example where there was a quantifiable group of people with a specific isolated set of constitutional violations that had to be redressed in a contained period of time. And it's used as kind of an example of what the opposite of the reparations proposals for Black Americans is, which in reality, as we know, this is not true. We need to understand that internment was a symptom of endemic racism, the same endemic racism that has plagued the United States for 400 years. And I think it's also important to remember that there is some discussion about redress as a tool to position Japanese Americans once again in the model minority, that it was some sort of buy into whiteness or a purely transactional exchange to get Japanese Americans to prevent Japanese Americans from allying with African Americans to argue for reparations. And there's a great quote from a legal scholar named Eric Yamamoto. And he says that in his view, Japanese American redress will not be seen by the mainstream and other communities of color as a buy-off or an exclusive transactional exchange, but that danger does exist unless Japanese Americans now and tomorrow press for racial, immigrant, gender, class, and sexual orientation justice in the United States. So just to reiterate, this is something that Japanese Americans can step up on, and that I believe we have a moral imperative to speak out about. So I'll go ahead and drop the link to the most current iteration of HR 40 in the chat, but you can see if your Congress member is a co-sponsor of it. If it is not, please reach out and contact them. All right, and with that, I'll pass it back to you, Kyle.
So thank you. We've seen a couple, not just the history of our support, but really current issues. And I know we're running slightly over, but what I'd like to do is still give our community a chance to have some conversation about this, not just about the previous questions, but how can we actually build on our history? How can we build on some of the issues that are confronting us today to keep pushing the boundaries of justice-centered work? What I think I'm going to do is ask McKenna to go ahead and schedule us in 10-minute breakouts. I know folks that'll push us past our 3:30 time, and if you aren't able to stay with us, that's okay. But I think it would be great if we could have, at the very least, our 10 minutes of dialogue, that we continue today. Okay.
Sounds good, Kyle. All right, opening those rooms now. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us as we go a little bit over today. I think we just have a few final words to share.
Mm-hmm. So Jess is going to talk about what will happen next, but I expressed in my breakout that I hope that you and the community stick with us, because we plan to have other conversations in the future.
All right. Thanks, Kyle, and thanks for everyone for joining part 4 today. In terms of an update with part 5 and 6, we will be having guest speaker, Dr. Ayana Yonemura. She is a scholar within ethnic studies, as well as being able to share her experience as both a mixed race, Black and Japanese scholar, just in terms of how we're going to think about anti-Blackness and also solidarity with other communities as well. The dates are going to be determined at a later time, but it will still be at the same time that we met today, from 2 to 3:30. We're also going to be sharing out an evaluation, looking over these questions in terms of what you want to learn next, what might be important for the community to be aware of, as well as questions you have about the next topic that we're going to be able to answer and delve into more as a community over Zoom. And before we close here today, I just want to express my gratitude to you, Kyle, for putting this community curriculum together for our workshops. But I also want to open it up to the presenters and the rest of the team to express their gratitude to Kyle.
Okage-sama de, Kyle. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, Kyle. It hit me this week as we were preparing that this is the last workshop that you framed out for us. And I just wanted to spend a moment while everyone's here and really thank you for all of the work and the love and the time you've poured into these workshops over the last 5 months. I know you've taught me so much and we just really, really value your contributions. So huge, huge thank you to you.
Yeah, I want to add that as much as I feel like I know a lot of JA history, Kyle always managed to bring up so many interesting ideas and tidbits of history that I just had never heard of, and to weave it all together in this context that is really, really helpful and tangibly useful. So Kyle, thank you for the hours upon hours of work that you put into this. It's been such an honor to work with you.
Echoing everyone's thoughts, this is basically that class in undergrad that I wish that my school offered, and now I get it here for free. It is absolutely amazing, Kyle. Thank you so much.
Yes, agreed. I feel like I'm, every time we have an organizing meeting, I'm like filling my notebook with notes. So thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate you putting in all the hours to basically prepare another class for us. So thank you so much.
Well, I want to, give gratitude to this team because this would not have happened without the energy of the team. The names of all the folks, and we introduced ourselves in the beginning. But, really, it is just incredible what this sort of collaboration cohesion has been able to produce. And yes, I put a little bit of work into it, it's true, but this wouldn't have taken place without this team coming together, without I think the really thoughtful way that we've reached out to the community, which was all the committee and not so much me, and the way that we framed all this. And the thing of it is that I want to say thank you for Okaga Day, because I know I stand on shoulders as well. And so I have to, give thanks to all the folks who have come before, and as well as all the folks who we work together with now. Bill and Stan, we're so glad that, you could be a part of this, because you played such a heroic role, in JCL. And I hope that we can continue this community. That's our plan. Once we've gotten this rolling, there's absolutely no way that we're going to abandon, the energy that we've created. And they're good, very, very, very good causes and reasons to do this. So, McKenna, do you want to, bring us home?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It is just such a wonder really to spend this time with you all. So thank you for the community. Thank you for the conversations. And we hope to see you at our next workshops. We'll send out information as we get more details. And please pay attention to our Facebook page, because we'll share information on our events there too. So thank you all. This concludes our workshop.